Good morning. Thank you for joining me for another 5 good minutes with the Word. I'm Barry Bryson, and we're continuing our study of the book of Titus, Paul's letter to Titus. And today we're going to talk about Titus and his own personal history. Um, Titus is one of Paul's most important co-workers. We read about how he came to Paul as a young man in a passage that we'll look at in just a second. Uh, we know that Paul, as he used Silas and Timothy, was also sending um, Titus back to churches as his representative. We'll read about that too. Only he's sending him into the hardest places to go. He sent him to Crete, that prompts the letter, and before that, he sent him to Corinth, which is the biggest mess of a congregation in all the New Testament. And so we know that. And then we have a reference to him in 2 Timothy chapter 4, verse 10. He's still part of Paul's mission team. They're at the very end of Paul's life. And and Paul has dispatched Timothy to Dalmatia, which is on the Adriatic coast. And he sent him there to do work as he's writing to Timothy at Ephesus and tells him, I need you to come to take care of me and be with me. Titus I've sent to Dalmatia. So Titus is still there. And we have Titus and Timothy connected again, even in Timothy, that second letter to Timothy. We first read about Titus in not the book of Acts. He's not mentioned at all in the book of Acts, which is another great puzzle. We mentioned yesterday that the word agape in any form fails to appear in the letter to Titus. That's a huge absence. But another huge absence is why isn't Titus in the book of Acts anywhere, not even just as a name in one of the we passages that Luke writes about. So many names but in Acts, but Titus is not named. We know about Titus from Paul's own pen, not from Luke. And when we first read about Titus in Galatians chapter 2, I know Galatians comes after Corinthians in the New Testament, but it's clearly an earlier text to be written. In Galatians chapter 2, I'll begin reading with verse 1. Paul's giving the Galatians his history. And he says, talks about his conversion, and then he went to Jerusalem, and then he left. Wasn't really well received, except Barnabas, who received him and took him around. And he says, after 14 years, I went up again to Jerusalem with Barnabas, taking Titus along as well. So we know from Acts that when he and Barnabas went again together, they went from Antioch. And so perhaps Titus is from Antioch, but he at least has been working with Paul when Paul and Barnabas were still a mission team. That's how long Titus has been working with Paul. Longer than just about anyone. So I took Titus along too. And it was because of a revelation that I went up and I submitted to them the gospel, which I preached among the Gentiles. But I did so in private to those who were of reputation, for fear that I might be running or had run in vain. This must be before Acts 15 and the Jerusalem conference. But not even Titus, who was with me, though he was a Greek, was compelled to be circumcised, because but it was because of false brethren who had sneaked in to spy our liberty with which we have in Christ in order to bring us into bondage. But we did not yield in subjection to them for even an hour, so that the truth of the gospel might remain with you. So he goes up to report to the elders and apostles in Jerusalem what he and Barnabas had been doing and how they'd been ministering to the Gentiles. And they took Titus along, who was himself a Gentile. Timothy's mother was Jewish, matrilineally a Jew, which means you are a Jew. But Titus is not a Jew. So Paul does not circumcise Titus before he takes him onto the mission field, the way he clearly and personally circumcised Timothy before he took him onto the mission field, which we read about in Acts chapter 16. So these two young men who had been with Paul from very early on, Paul refuses to circumcise one, but he himself personally circumcises the other. Um, and so this is the first reference that we have to Titus. And then we have already mentioned the reference to him in Second Timothy, but we have these references to him in Second Corinthians. Between First and Second Corinthians, Paul has sent and is sending um, Silas back to try to take care of business, try to help them through this patch that they're in, this terrible place where they're just an awful excuse for a congregation. When you read about what was happening at worship and what they were doing and the way they were just so awful to each other, um, and 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 so he sends not Timothy there, he sends Titus there, which he mentions multiple times. He talks about being bereft of Titus, not finding Titus in chapter 2, um, and in verse 14, um, no, verse 13, excuse me. And then in chapter 8, I want to read a couple of passages from chapter 8 about that he writes about Titus. Chapter 8, verse 6, he says, "Consequently, we urge Titus that as he had previously made a beginning, so he would also complete in you this gracious work as well." So, Titus was there for the beginning of this work, and has two works in mind here. One is the collection of the saints, for the saints in Jerusalem. That's the topic of chapters 8 and 9. But also the work among the Corinthian brethren. So he sends Titus there. And not only to receive their gift and to make sure there was a gift, but to take care of them as well. And then at the end of the chapter, he says this about Titus, verses 23 and 24. "As for Titus, he is my partner and fellow worker among you. As for our brethren, they are messengers of the churches, a glory to Christ. Therefore, openly before the churches, show them the proof of your love and for our reason for boasting about you." He's asking for them to take care of Titus and to supply any need that he might have. And he says he's my partner. He's my partner and my co-worker, my colleague, my fellow worker among you. Um, anyway, um, I want us to think about what Paul says about Timothy in Philippians 4 when he calls Timothy, he's my son in the faith. I don't have anybody that I work with that's like-minded with me like Timothy is. These two men don't have the same relationship with the Apostle Paul, but he he describes Titus as a colleague, and he describes Timothy as a son. And I think therein lies, the difference in their relationship. I think Titus is more seen by Paul as maybe a peer, not not that he's an apostle, but he's someone that Paul respects, trusts, man to man. I need this job done, and I think even when he's writing Second Timothy at the end of his life, Paul still raising Timothy up as a father does a son. And anyway, so that's what we know about Titus. He's working on the Dalmatian coast when Paul is executed, and that's the last we hear from him in the New Testament. When we're together next time, start looking at the text of the letter to Titus. Thank you for joining me for what is now nearly 10 good minutes with the Word.